Hey everyone, my name is Matt Phelan and I'm co-founder of an organisation called the Happiness Index. We spend our days trying to understand what makes people happy at work and also how that links to how people perform at work.
We met yonks ago on some e-consultancy event. Then you were running a digital agency. So how do you get from running a digital agency to now being the guy behind how people enjoy themselves at work?
If you think back to that era, which slightly ages us both, but there was a saying in marketing, I think it comes from John Wanamaker, which is 50% of my marketing works. The problem is I don't know what 50%.
Yeah.
And if you think about that e-consultancy and that era of businesses that you were running and I was running, we were trying to get data onto that to figure that conundrum out. And over time, it's improved, probably not as quickly as people would have expected as you look back. But marketing has now become more informed. Whether it's got better is a whole nother conversation for another podcast. But definitely more informed by data. And we're running our business on data. But the thing that we believed was really important, culture, didn't really have much data out there. And there wasn't really much to look into. And I also knew a lot of people running businesses that weren't treating their people very well, but they were also being successful. So personally, I was 25. I was trying to understand, like, how should I be running this business? And you get lots of statements. Like the one that we latched on to, we really liked was, and I keep saying to this, like to the newer entrepreneurs, that there didn't really used to be that many famous entrepreneurs you could look out for or look towards. So Richard Branson was one that a lot of people spoke about. And he had a saying that your customers don't come first, your people come first, you look after your customers, and then you make more money. That was one of his principles. But we wanted to actually look into the data and figure out, is that true? Or is that just a nice thing to say? Because if you go and look at most websites, they'll say their people is their greatest asset. And then you go on their Glassdoor ratings and you kind of realize maybe they're not. So that's how we got into that world. It's a very geeky, just trying to understand and navigate the world and think, well, if data's been used more in marketing, maybe it could be used in the rest of the business. And that's where we got with the culture piece.
How did your fascination with culture end up being the business though?
So we built it for ourselves. So if you walked into our office, which people thought was high risk, you could see on a screen how happy our customers were and how happy our employees were.
Yeah.
And everyone always freak out about that. They would be like, oh my God, well, what if they go down? And we would be like, well, that's normal. They will go down. Black Friday is a massively busy period at the moment for agencies. So it's not a surprise. People will be stressed. And I think that comes from a perception that scores that go up are good and scores that go down are bad. And I can't remember who this quote comes from, but there's a really great saying that you should never confuse a metric with a target.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important thing. A good example would be your heartbeat. Your heartbeat is a great metric, but it's not a target. You're not trying to get it up all the time. And we do that in business all the time where, generally speaking, revenue going up is a good thing, right? I can't argue that going down I can't think of many examples of that going down. But quite often metrics going down are an opportunity to learn, as opposed to what a lot of companies do, which is like try and find out whose fault it is and fire them.
Yes.
So that's kind of how we see them as metrics. They're intelligence that you can use in your business to make better decisions.
Okay. Where should we start unpicking some of this? So what did you start doing in the agency? Take me back. Like, what things did you start to measure?
If you saw version 1 of the Happiness Index, I mean, it's embarrassing. There's this saying in tech, for the tech people listening will know this, Dominic, which is, if you're not embarrassed by version 1 of your product, you launched too late. And we had no idea what we were doing. At that point, we had no neuroscience baked in. We understood the difference between correlation and causation. But at that point, we were only looking at, does something correlate? And for the data people out there, just a reminder on correlation versus causation. You can find loads of stuff that correlates, but it doesn't necessarily cause it. So a classic example would be umbrellas going up correlates with rain. But it doesn't mean because loads of people put their umbrellas up, it caused the rain. And people get them mixed up quite a lot. So at that point, we were just trying to look at the metrics of just see on a graph, was employee happiness and customer happiness, was there a kind of relationship? When one went up, did it go down, and so on? And we didn't get on to the causation of like what drives happiness, what drives unhappiness, what creates a great team, all these things until much later. But going back to the entrepreneurial thing, what happened is We built it for the agency, and then all our customers started asking for it. And we were like, you can't have that because it's rubbish. It's just like an internal tool. It's just bit, you know what it's like when you build something for yourself, it's got a bit of blue tack
Yeah.
in the back end of
Yeah.
it. But when enough people ask for something, your entrepreneurial hat switched back on, and we thought, you know what, there's something pretty special building here. And we were already planning to sell the agency. We'd got it to a nice size. Then we basically sold it, and then rather than, we were still relatively young, rather than like taking life easy, we decided to double down and take that money and put it into the next business, which I've regretted at some points and been
Did you get to prove to your own satisfaction that employee happiness drove customer happiness and drove revenue growth or profitability?
again, I'm not picking on all the sayings, but you know that saying, if you can measure it, you can manage it.
Yeah.
That's what we thought would happen, but I found that to be probably the most untrue thing of the journey, which is, we believed if we could measure it, we could manage it. But what we realized we were getting into is measuring emotions, which are really complex things. So
Yep.
this will never get written on my gravestone, and it will never get written down as a quote that ever gets repeated beyond this podcast. But I think what is true is, if you can measure it, you can better understand it. If you can better understand it, you can put it whatever way you want. Less S decisions, or more better decisions, whatever way round you want to put it.
Yeah.
I think that, can you measure it, you can manage it, kind of makes everything sound robotic. That if you measure it, then out the other end of it is going to be perfection. I think what it is if you can measure it, you can better understand it. The better you understand something, the better your decision making. But you're still going to make wrong decisions.
I was just thinking back to your correlation causality, oh, look, umbrellas are going up,
Yeah,
right? And then you go, okay, well, how do we have fewer umbrellas? Oh, we have, you might then say we have to have fewer rainy days. Okay, well, and then you're on to measuring something over which you've got no control.
exactly. It's about understanding something that, the more I've got into it, the more I believe is incredibly important, which is the emotional state of an organization. But it doesn't give you the perfection that lots of people like to imagine, that businesses are just, you can just like put everything in a box and run it like a computer, but it's not like that. But once you've got that data, you wouldn't want to give it up, because it becomes so powerful.
Maybe we jump to now and go, like, what does it look like now then? How sophisticated are you now, and what's your value prop to your customers?
Yeah, so the value prop's definitely changing, in a world of technology and AI. So at the moment, we're gathering data from 170 different countries.
Hmm.
So in the summer, we'll launch the largest and deepest study into workplace happiness ever. That'll be launched at our event in June. I think the value prop has changed over time. From, at the beginning, it was very much about the technology. We had unique technology that you could use, and that is still true to this day. But the thing that has got even more value in it is the understanding and the insight behind what we're collecting.
Uh-huh.
And that's it, because it's outgrown. Our insight, that we are collecting, is outgrowing the technology. Technology is still great, but what we're getting from the insight is more powerful than the technology, if that makes sense. Even though one powers the other, we couldn't collect it without the technology. But the future will look different to the past for us.
What are the insights? You said 100, and how many how many
170
countries?
countries.
Is that all of the countries in the world almost?
Well, it depends who you ask, but it's not. There's still a lot to go, and then obviously there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world, isn't there, at the moment, about what's a country and what's a not. But it's a substantial amount.
Is happiness genuinely that? Is it the same across the world? And do you have to define it in a particular way to make it the same, or?
It's a really good question. I think the place to start with that is, the thing that people measure most across the world, generally as metrics, are either employee engagement,
Hmm.
or employee net promoter score has also become very popular. And both of
Hmm.
those we measure in our platform. But the beautiful thing about happiness, and if we had academics here, they would define happiness as subjective well-being. That's
Hmm.
what we talk about in our business is universally described as subjective well-being. And then the thing that changes, are you talking about the past, the present, or the future? Now, the thing about the current business metrics is, unless you're in business, they're kind of like BS to 99% of people. Because if you go down the pub, people don't talk about how engaged they are at work or their employee net promoter score, which doesn't happen. So we take all of the metrics around the world, and the easiest one to get people to understand is happiness. Because no matter what the language is in, like, so in Brazil, they call us chi, in Romania, they call us tahashi. But no matter what the language is, people get what the happiness is. When it comes to all the other metrics, there's big differences locally. And there are differences in how people record their happiness. But generally speaking, if you just get in a one-on-one conversation with anyone around the world, they will understand what we're talking about. And we learned a lot from. Have you watched Inside Out, Dominic, from Pixar?
Nope.
If anyone doesn't get the happiness index, because I've not explained it very well, go and watch Pixar's Inside Out. Anyone, and also anyone who's got children, watch it with them,
Right.
because I was really lucky in the early days of the happiness index, probably at an e-consultancy event, got to meet the creative director of Pixar, and I was just trying to understand why was Pixar successful. And he said to me, the reason Pixar is successful is because it's built on global emotions. So I was like, well, what does that mean? And he said, when we design a story and build a movie, every emotion, we only include things that are global in it. And what his point was,
Ah,
and he said, I was like, why? Why are you doing that? And he was like, the test is, you could grab people from any country in the world, you could sit them down and watch a Pixar movie without the sound on, and the people who are watching the movie could understand what's going on. So the happiness index today measures the emotional state of an organization. And really, if we were to start it today, it would be called the emotional index. But the happiness index became the first thing that we indexed. So that's what we've become known as. And we've decided not to change it from a brand perspective. But that was what I found fascinating, is that emotions are how we
mhm.
as human beings. They're how we remember stuff. They're why people fall in love. They're why people purchase something. I mean, the craziness that's been going on about the Jaguar rebrand, I just can't get my head around it. Like, people are going like crazy. I think, but it's emotionally driven, isn't it? And I just think, of all the problems in the world, if we could get everyone as motivated on all the problems we've got as people are about the Jaguar rebrand, we wouldn't have any problems in the world. But this is us. We're human beings. That's what is so beautiful. We think we're very rational, but really we're not. We're emotionally driven beings.
I didn't know anyone cared about Jaguar anymore,
That's the
but
point.
obviously some people do.
That's what the point is. Nobody cared, and then they tried to rebrand, and now everyone's not happy. It's like when a chocolate brand gets discontinued, isn't it? That no one's eaten for ages, and everyone's, oh my god, they need to bring it back.
You're right. It's the emotion, because it brings back memories of their childhood or cars their dad used to drive or what have you, but
Yeah,
that they wouldn't necessarily buy themselves.
yeah,
I've got a question for you on a employee net promoter score. That is where we ask the question, would you recommend company X to a friend or colleague on a 10-point scale? I can't find any research. Like, there's research on net promoter score, obviously, and I've used net promoter score,
yeah,
but I've got a number of anecdotes where the EMPS just is a waste of time, or where companies have changed to something else and there has been correlation or even maybe causality, but certainly people seem to want to use it. But I
yeah,
can't find any research that says, if it goes from 37 to 40, 37 to 77, that something is a result.
yeah,
That what might you get? Well, you might get more CVs from the employees, friends, right? Are you tracking that? No. Okay, well, track that. Okay, some people do track that, and people who track that say that didn't change.
yeah.
And you might expect that employee retention to go down. But again, I don't see anyone can show me research where this is something worth gathering, other than to say the companies where they have it a high number want to share it with the world because they think it proves something.
I think you're definitely going in the right direction with it. I put it in the category of the 10,000 steps that everyone's, which is,
Yes.
for those that don't know, was pretty much invented by a guy who wanted to sell pedometers for the Tokyo Olympics in whenever. But it doesn't mean 10,000 steps is bad for us. And you know what? If you're not doing 10,000 steps, it's a nice goal, it's a move forward. But I think what happens again, like business, we try to simplify this human side of it, and we like to imagine that just one question can be the answer, and then that's it. And just in like when we set up the happiness index, it was just like one question: how happy are you at work? We thought, right, this is it, we're onto it, this is the thing. But it's not that simple. And I think the big challenge we have with employee net promoter score, because we do our technology can track any metric,
Hmm.
and most companies do track employee net promoter score, but most that are American or what you'd call as the traditional West. So Western companies get it. When we go around the world, that question on its own in some countries is perceived as quite an unprofessional question to ask someone. Like, why are you asking
Mm.
someone about whether they recommend this place to a family member? It from a cultural perspective, it just doesn't land in many other places.
Uh-huh.
So I would say, as a sort of a one question in a set, it's useful. But if you make it, Gallup do the same with, have you got a best friend at work? I can't remember the exact wording of it.
Yeah.
Have you got a friend, or have
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
got, and
Yeah.
they're,
No, have you got a best friend at work? It's question 8 or 9 on their 12 questions.
yeah, and it's a useful question, but I mean, you look at it, they're prepared to die on that horse. Like if it's like in there, it's like in their whole methodology. But I think it's one of those things that's become more than it actually is. And again, people try and isolate that question out. But
Well, I look, I love this question, right? Because Gallup say, look, it's in there because when they look at high performing teams answer that question. It's like correlation, like the umbrella goes up, right? And when I've got somebody in front of me and they say, well, I've never had a best friend at work, I get to say, well, maybe you've never been in a high performing team.
yeah,
And that becomes a really interesting conversation because most people haven't been in a high performing team. They've spent their entire working lives in a mediocre company doing mediocre work with mediocre colleagues.
yeah, I don't see it that way from the data from our data set.
Ah, okay.
I think it's, have you seen the TED Talk, Super Chickens?
No.
So that's a great TED Talk, and it's about how on a very regular basis competitive environments get mistaken for high performance environments.
Okay.
And what that is, in the reason that they use the framework of Super Chickens is, what you get is you get loads of people that are outgoing, extroverted, and they're the people that you imagine a high performer is, and they take all the credit. And what happens is, in that environment, some amazingly brilliant, quiet people slowly lose and leave the business. So what we
Hmm.
often find is people have what they think is a high performance culture, but what they've actually created is a small culture of a few amount of people that can perform, but they don't create a culture where lots of people can perform. And this is where, and I saw your post about bringing sports people into your business and the advantages that brings, which I don't disagree with. But one of the challenges that happens to businesses all the time, and I've made this mistake, so I'll share my mistake. People who like sports read a sports book, and then they turn up at the meeting on Monday and they're like, this is the way that we're going to do it. I've read about Clive Woodward's done this, or I've read this person's done that, and we're going to do this here. The example I'll share my failure was there's a book called Does It Make the Boat Go Faster? Which,
Yeah.
incredible book. I love that book. But if you want to get 8 rowers to win the Olympics and high perform, there is a totally different environment. If you take our biggest customer, they've got 400,000 employees. Now, if you take the principles of what is about 8 people in a boat to win an Olympic gold medal, it is totally, totally different. And I remember our head of HR, when we were running our agency, Emma, she came to me and she was like, yeah, it's all great, all this, does it make the boat go faster? But we're losing people off the back. And it was a real wake up call for me, because this is, I think there's a real lack of understanding of what high performance is. And I think sports sometimes, but it should be used as an inspiration and for us to take ideas from. But actually, it sometimes gets confused, because let's take one of our clients. They've got 8,000 staff. They've got their main staff are bar staff. Now, what you need in that culture could be very different. So for me, going back to the original point, I think that question is a valuable question. But when you make it the be all end all, the most important thing, that's where the problems come.
What problem are you trying to solve for your clients? Is it different for different clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the complexity of culture.
We use a tool called Culture Canvas with our clients, right? Because
Yeah,
once we've set the strategic goal, help them they've set the strategic goals with us.
yeah,
Then we say, okay, well, what culture will support that? And I was just thinking that, your bar staff example, tenure is important, right? So at a high performance level, you might say, well, it's not about how many pints you can pull per hour.
yeah,
Well, I suppose it might be, but you're likely to get better at these things if you stay for a longer time,
yeah,
assuming you have, I'm just thinking about some work that Nationwide did, the tenure of their financial advisors drove profitability over time
yeah,
because they got better at it. And I know restaurants and hotels in the past where they've paid higher wages have impacted customer satisfaction. And
yeah.
so is there a profit motive ahead of the culture piece as opposed to just creating a happy workplace and not having a profit motive?
It just depends on the customer. So we work with UK Sport, so we work with the ECB, we work with retail, and this is an interesting one from retail on tenure. We did a piece of work where we looked at all the metrics and the most successful chains in their store. I can't say their name, but everyone was shopped there pretty much. When we looked into their data, they had tenure as a target, like keeping
Hmm.
people here a long time. When we actually looked into the data and went through it, all of their stores that were performing to the highest as stores were run by someone who'd been there the least amount of time.
Wow.
Sometimes you get into the data and you're like, this is the opposite to what I was expecting. Now, there's two ways you could look at that. One, people are getting complacent over time. Two, people are coming in with fresh ideas. Three, which is probably the most in this example, was the training and support for people over time wasn't well thought out. So you'd come in, you'd have a couple of years where you can really progress. And this is what I mean about, like, we've been really clear about what high performance is. They would kind of left alone if they hit their numbers, but then they all
Uh-huh.
hit a ceiling because they weren't trained and developed. So that's just an example of sometimes you get in. That's the difference between a metric and a target, because they made tenure a target where actually it was a metric, like to actually look into.
Yes.
And you go, oh, something interesting here.
Well, we've been having a debate inside one of our clients at the moment about tenure, about the negative impact of tenure. And if you want somebody to be amazing at something and they have been doing it for 20, they've been doing the same job for 20 years, is
Yeah,
it likely that they are more or less resistant to change?
yeah,
And all things considered, would you want somebody who's done the same job in the same company for 20 years, or would you want somebody who every 5 years has changed and developed and got better over time? Or at least there's even if they're doing the same job, had seen it done in four different companies versus only seen it done in yours, right? And so this was a really
yeah.
interesting debate last week with a client.
That's what I mean about understand it better. There isn't a definitive answer to that.
No.
But it's an important one to have, which helps people understand what's going on, what they want, what does good look like, so that you can put a plan in place to get there. Because age is a good example of how misunderstood age is. Like, I know some people in their 60s who are more like 18-year-olds, and I know people in their early 20s that are like stuck in their ways already.
Yep.
So all of these things, they're so loaded with cultural stereotypes and so on. So, but exactly what you're doing there in your client, that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to make people question and ask and sort of interrogate and try and understand deeper, so that, going back to the point, you can make better decisions.
Do you have a heuristic or a rule of thumb about happier people work harder and or are more productive?
If you look through the main research points that are not from ours, probably the most comprehensive study on productivity is done by Oxford University and
Uh-huh.
conducted at BT. And that shows that happier employees are more productive. That study was done in a call center. That was done by Professor Jan de Neve, incredible piece. The longest study in terms of research into happiness is a little bit, well, it's not just a little bit flawed, it's 50% flawed. It's the Yale University study. Great study, gets probably the most quoted. If you've read a study on it, you've probably heard of it. Problem is, it's only done on men. So it
Right.
just needs to be relabeled, the study of male happiness, as an example. The largest study is done on the NHS in this country by Professor Jeremy Dawson. Incredible study, about 1 million employees. And this is quite scary, Dominic. If you went into two hospitals and everything was the same, the hospital with the unhappier employees has a higher death rate. And that's not done in a country we've not heard of. It's the country that I think we both live
That
in
we
right
live
now.
in. How many people get killed by unhappy people versus saved by happy people?
I think I would check it. I've got a podcast on it where I interview him and go through the exact numbers. I don't
Yeah.
have to plan, but it's in the single digit percentages. But that it's a serious amount to
Yeah.
make people realize. And when you get into the why of that, some of it starts to become quite obvious. Which is, so you mentioned productivity and a couple of other factors. Another factor that you're not as good at when you're unhappy is accuracy of task.
Right.
So if you take out the incompetent people in any profession, I don't think it's that NHS staff are unhappy and they turn up at work and they can't be bothered and they're this. It's subconscious. Anyone who's ever been in a job or a position or a relationship where you're not happy with, you're just not. You just can't perform to the highest level. And if you apply that over millions of operations, it's gonna. Unfortunately, when the outcome is patient health, that's what we see. And I'd recommend everyone. I think it should be on the sort of like taught at schools, that study. I think it's incredibly important.
So, what do the happy hospitals do differently to the unhappy hospitals?
That's a really good question. What I can do is share the macro data on that. But the biggest surprise in the research that I asked the professor is around discrimination. And it actually does fit back a little bit around what we said about relationships and friendships. So the number one driver of happiness at work, according to our data set and many others, is relationships.
Uh huh.
But the flip of that is when you're excluded from that world of relationships and so on. So to answer your question in a reverse way, the hospitals that have the happier employees are where they've fostered really strong relationships. Where it's not working, when I spoke to Professor Jeremy Dawson, he was saying where there is levels of discrimination. We're not talking just one level. We're not talking about just race or gender or age. He's talking about it generally. But it obviously kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Which is, if you're excluded from a group for some reason that's not to do with your skill, guess what? You're gonna be unhappy. Like we are social beasts as human beings.
Yes. I'd seen Jordan Peterson talk about, when challenging people around toxic masculinity,
Yeah,
he was looking at data on male nurses in hospitals,
yeah,
where the majority of the staff are female feeling excluded. Or I saw another piece of research where somebody in the UK was talking about male teachers in primary schools in the UK,
yeah,
again, feeling excluded and
yeah.
discriminated against in exactly the same way that women say they are discriminated against in a majority male working environment. But I have I'm going to move off that because,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right, if relationships is the most important bit in the office or work from home.
Oh, it's a question that I think I'm not questioning your ability as a questioner. I think it's the wrong question.
Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. What's the right question?
I think the right question is, if you're leading a team, what is the best environment for this team to thrive and perform? And then work back from that, because at the moment, I always find this funny that often the prime minister is the person that's bringing this question up, and the prime minister works from home. Literally number 10. It made me funny. It just made me laugh when Rishi was like bashing people working from home, and I was like, that's literally what you do. But I think it gets caught up. Another thing I just want to pick up on on the debate that we see in our data is the word flexibility. People confuse flexible working with location working. So let's take an obvious one. People go, oh, security guard can't work from home. They need to secure the building. A good example of flexibility for security guard would be able to, for example, switch their shifts with someone else so they could attend their daughter's sports day.
Hmm.
So what I can share from you, I can't answer the home or work debate. What I can say to you is when you look in our data set, what people want is flexibility. You can have a company that allow people to work from home that are not very flexible, and you can have a company that require people to be in the office that are very flexible. And I think we end up in this argument about the location when I feel like it's the wrong argument, which is just take a step back and go, what's the best way for this team to thrive and perform?
Yeah, I get that. I was just thinking, I'd heard an interview with Professor Dunbar,
Yep.
and he'd said, look, human beings are sociable creatures, and relationships are important to happiness.
Yep.
So I've got clients who've been remote first forever, like pre-COVID. And I remember talking to the CEO there years ago, like even before COVID, and he said, Dom, our employees don't get any community from work.
Yep.
They get that outside of work. So, there must be a difference in terms of building relationships. And I've just been coaching somebody in a French startup at the moment, and just doing some interviews of her team. They're all fully remote. They never meet in person. And what they were talking to me about was the quality of the relationships in their team. They all said, we just don't really know anybody else on our team. You must have to work hard and different to build relationships in a remote first world.
Yeah, and I think there's just two bits I want to pick up on there on the Dunbar point around relationships. It's absolutely spot on. But if you think about relationships and your best relationships, if you were going to organize the best like meetup or party, if you were just thinking about your personal relationships, you wouldn't book it in an office. It's not where you'd go. That's not the place to build relationships. If you were starting from afresh and you were going, right, I've got 20 people here, forget whatever part of life it is, the actual office, it's very unlikely that you would go, that's the place that we would go. If you were starting from a
Well,
blank sheet.
well, it's interesting because in his book on Friends, he said men and women are diametrically opposite in terms of how they build relationships, right? So men do things and women talk to each other. He says, which
Yeah.
is why two women who spend all day together can come home and then pick up the phone and then call each other, and the blokes are thinking, how could they possibly still have something to say, right?
Yeah.
And so, yes, we wouldn't necessarily do it in an office because we're blokes. We'd want to be doing something. Whereas actually, if all we need to do is talking, then an office might be an entirely reasonable place to
It would
hang
be.
out. In fact, maybe you don't even care where you're talking.
Yeah, but if that was the case, women would be booking out offices to go and meet up to talk. So my point is, it's the same point as before, which is start from a blank sheet rather than making an assumption about
Yeah.
the office. And the second point is that I do, again, I'm not either way on this, by the way. I'm just saying that people need to really consider rather than just doing it. And my final point is that we've had, I don't know how long the office cultures exist. Let's pick a number. Let's say 70 years. We've had 70 years of working out how to work in an office. We've only had a few years of working in, let's call it distributed for a second. And that's what I think.
Totally.
That's what I think that where the work needs to go, which is start from a blank sheet. And then if you get to the answer is an office, then that's absolutely fine. But don't start with the assumption that it's either at home or in the office, because we're the happiness index, we're hybrid, and we feel that both are very useful for different things. So we've started with a blank. We're in the pandemic. Where the hell are we going to go after this? And we've converged on both are useful for different things.
Okay. I've got some quick fire questions for you.
Yeah.
What drives you?
Probably two things. I think probably not starting out with anything is I always think that I'm going to have no money for my children tomorrow. So I am driven by fear. I'm not afraid to admit that. That's something I'm driven by fear, which is in our model. Safety is a top four driver of happiness. And then it's almost like the opposite or the end of the spectrum of it, which is adventure. Like I like trying to do really difficult things. I could have started another agency after doing an agency, trying to understand things that I definitely didn't, and I still probably learning every single day. So the adventure bit, I'd say driven by fear and adventure, which is, I don't know, listeners are probably thinking that it's complete opposites, but they're both important to me. I need to feel like I'm creating a safe future for my children, but I also need to mix it up with some adventure and some risks, and sometimes they collide.
Brilliant. What's your genius?
I definitely don't have one. I just, sorry to say that.
Maybe a curiosity?
No, I don't. I, I don't necessarily believe in genius. I just think just trying to work out stuff, have some fun along the way.
Okay.
In writing the last book, I did discover I was thinking about the meaning of life, and when I looked at the data, I worked out that I think the meaning of life is finding meaning in life.
Uh-huh.
For me, that's what life's about. Like, everyone's got their own different bits, and people come together. I coach girls football, so I know all about the different parts coming together. So I don't ever see anyone as a genius. It's about all the little bits coming together. But I think if you can find meaning in what you do, I think you can enjoy life.
Okay. What unpopular opinion do you hold?
The Tottenham Hotspurs are never going to win the league, unfortunately. It saddens me to say this out loud, but it's very unpopular in my family.
Okay. What's the most significant risk you've taken?
Oh, I think I'm too much on the risk bit. I have the fear bit, but like
Right.
after selling our first company, we put everything into the happiness index, and that has been an incredibly good situation. But in the pandemic, like lots of companies, there was times where we're a bit like, "Oof, are we going to make this through?" Because what happened to the happiness index in the pandemic is people never needed our services more than ever, but there was a mini credit crunch like 2008 all over again, where cash just stopped, and
Yeah.
we had this really weird thing where we're busier and busier, but there's less cash coming in. And you hear about those companies, don't you, that are really successful but just run out of cash. And luckily, about 5 weeks in, 6 weeks in, things switched really quickly.
Hmm.
That was probably the biggest risk, where I thought, because my assessment in my head is I'm young, I don't need to like put any aside. I can just go like all in, like Vegas style. But I think I wouldn't do that again, even though it's turned out all right. I would never do that again.
How do you measure success outside of business?
Am I being a good dad, and am I being good at my job as well? And if I can do both are important, because I do want to set an example to my children about business and life as well. They're both important to me together, but that's what's going to be remembered, isn't it? Am I a good dad? No one's going to remember the rest.
And what's the most recent skill you've learned?
Coaching 11-year-old girls football, the hardest skill I've ever developed. And it's made everything else in life seem easy. That's what I would say.
Brilliant. And is your daughter one of those 11-year-olds?
Yeah, yeah, she
That's
is.
even harder, I
It's
think.
a lot. It creates a lot of challenges, but you really get into it. Like I'm not going into my preaching element, but for those that don't know, the FA banned football in this country up until 1971. So for women to play football is actually quite rare if you put it over a 100-year period. And the more you
Yeah.
get into it, the more you realise so many sports clubs have been on their knees for so long, because they have basically ignored half of the demographic. And once you reintroduce women's sports back into communities and clubs, you see some pretty magic stuff happen. And I'd recommend anyone listening to go and check out Lewis FC, first club in the world to pay their men and women the same, and you can become an owner for 50 quid. But I think they're second or third behind Barcelona in memberships now. So yeah, I've become very passionate about that world.
Very good. And one last thing. What's the biggest myth in business?
If you can measure it, you can manage it.
Very good. Very good. And of course, your books, we get lots of book recommendations. So what books have you got? Because sadly, there's another bloke called Matt Phelan who's written a lot of children's books.
He's brilliant. He's great.
Uh,
Go and check him out. They're brilliant. I've read some. They're amazing. They're much better than my books. Go and check him out. Matt Phelan draws.
Do you know what? Do you know what? I went on and I went, oh God, yeah, I've read a load of these to my kids. Must be a different Matt Phelan,
Yeah, yeah.
surely. Yeah.
We have exchanged messages. because I sometimes get his messages. It's really beautiful. Like sometimes get like, I just want to let you know that my kids love this book, and it's like really, it's really nice. You could like my brother, Pat Phelan. My parents are not creative. He shared a name with someone like a mass murdering. But I luckily share a name with someone who is known for doing beautiful books. So I'm really happy with that because I get lovely messages all the time.
So, what are yours called?
So the first one was just what I was doing in the pandemic, which is the business case for happiness. That's trying to work out like what's the business benefit of it, because sadly not everyone will get on board because they think it's the right thing to do. And then the second one is after many creative meetings with Wiley, the publisher, it was called the Happiness Index, which after, it's like sometimes you just get back to the obvious. Um, but that was also funny because the guy that runs the key company, he then launched a book just after me called the Happiness Index. I forget what his name is, but he's like head of prisons now under the new government.
Yes,
But yeah, so there's
Timpson.
another. That's it. So Timpson's got a book out the same name as me, and then there's another guy called Matt Phelan. But if you're into I think James Timpson's done almost a good thing for us because his book is about he's evangelical. He's like saying it's a great idea to look after your people, and then my book
Yeah,
is presenting the data behind this is what's happening in the brain and the body of your employees if you look after them.
fab. And what you got a couple of books that people should read if they're interested in this topic that have been inspirational to you?
I think there's so many books. I think I'll give it just a fun one because I think you got to have the fun
Yeah.
side of it as well. The Little Book of Hygge, and Hygge is
Okay.
a Danish word for people that don't know, and it's written by a friend of mine. He's got the best name for a Danish guy. He's called Mike Viking, and it's his actual name, and it's a renowned bestseller. Hygge is spelled Hygge, um, but it sort of gets you onto the subject in a nice way. Um, and then I think The Happiness Advantage by Sean Aker is probably the first time I read that. If that sort of starts the journey of people getting into the subject, because I don't know whether it's John Lennon. There's many stories, but long story short, that book gets into that you think if you go to school, get good exams, get a good job, go up the ladder, you'll become happy. And that was the first time I heard it flipped on its head of actually those that are happier perform better. That's the first time I heard it before I got into the data. And so Sean Aker has done some that he was the sort of guy that got me into looking at this and getting into the data. I would say there are a couple of nice places to start, but it's a very deep subject. There's a few entry points, but once you get into it, there's probably 20 books I could read that people start getting into.
Absolute pleasure chatting to you again. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Dominic.